Hello and welcome to our SOFA series. Tonight we are going to be talking about history, and I know that we have some history fans in the group, so that will be fantastic. Just before we get started, I would like to make the land recognition. As long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the river flows, UFCW Local 832 acknowledges that we are gathered and work each day on the ancestral lands, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. Our offices are located on Treaty 1 and 2 territory, and our work extends into Treaties 3, 4, and 5. We recognize the injustice done to the Indigenous people of this land and are committed to supporting and collaborating with Indigenous communities in the spirit of truth and reconciliation. So thank you for joining us. I'm Erin Selby from UFCW. I'm the Director of Education and Training. Tonight, joining me is Jonathan Ferguson, who is the Senior Curator at the Royal Canadian Artillery Museum. And we will be learning a little bit more about the history of CFB Shilo. Before we get started, Jonathan, is the museum on the base at Shilo? Where is it?
It is, yes. So we're in an old gun shed, as it's called, on the base, and so it's a building that goes back into use as an active artillery gun housing building, and it's accessible to the public. The gates are not normally closed, as some people might assume. So as you drive down the Trans-Canada, you'll see the signs for our museum, and you can follow the signs from there to the base. It's maybe 10 minutes off of the Trans-Canada. And for people who maybe haven't been on military bases very much, it's not regularly closed off. And so it's normally open to the public. And you can find our museum there on the base. You can stay for lunch at the restaurant and everything else. But yeah, it's accessible to the public on the base.
Okay, perfect. Because people, when they hear tonight, they might be interested in more. So welcome and thank you, Jonathan, for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to you, and then I'm going to come back at the end and answer any questions that folks may have for you.
Okay, that sounds great.
I will ask them. You will answer them.
I will try.
Thank you, Jonathan. Take it away.
All right. And so what I'm going to try to do then is to share my screen. And let's see if this is successful. Can I get a thumbs up or a yes if people can see the full screen now?
Looks great.
Superb. Okay, great. So just to introduce myself a little bit and the subject, I'm new to Manitoba. I moved here at the end of January of this year, and I'm coming from Ontario. I'm in some ways a COVID refugee. I had been working at the Royal Ontario Museum for many years, since around 2004. And they are not doing well because of ticket sales and other issues. And that, together with the fact that real estate is so expensive in Toronto, when the opportunity to apply for this job came up, I sprang for it. It was a bit of a shift for me because my background is in archaeology, mostly classical archaeology and archaeology of the ancient Near East, Jordan specifically, but also some military history and historical archaeology as well. And so this tied in pretty well. But the clincher really is also that I'm an Army reservist myself, and so this let me meld my two passions for history and museums together with serving with the local Army Reserve Unit and working here on the base with the regular force people. And so yes, I'm happy to have taken up the position there as senior curator at the RCA Museum. It's a small team. It's very talented though. And so we keep very busy with developing new temporary exhibits, with revamping our standing permanent exhibits, and in hosting other incoming exhibits as well. Just to let you know, right now we've got an Afghanistan exhibit that's going to be opening in January of this year. It's coming from the military museums in Calgary. And simultaneously with that, we are revamping our own Afghanistan display. And so that's kept me very busy for the last couple months now, working on that. So it's, a constantly shifting experience at museums as you're bringing in the new and revamping the old. Okay, so that's a little bit about me. New to Manitoba, new to this position, but fitting in with both the Army side and with the museological side of things. So I'm going to be talking to you about a history of CFB Shilo. And Shilo is designated as being the home station of the Royal Regiment of Canadian Artillery. And it's not exclusively an artillery army base. Certainly that's not the case now. It's about half artillery and half infantry, plus all the supporting trades that go along with that. And you'll see that there's an emphasis towards the artillery, and that's largely because of our museum. It has been established there now for many years because Shilo was for many years the location for the Royal Canadian Artillery School, where gunners from across Canada earned their gunner's badge. And that's now moved to CFB Gagetown, but the base is home now to the oldest regiment in the regular force, in fact, 1st Regiment Royal Canadian Artillery. Royal Canadian Horse Artillery, I should say, which is part of the Royal Canadian Artillery. So we'll look at a history of CFB Shilo, but as you'll see, the history at the site actually goes back much farther than the name itself does. So that should advance. There we go. Okay, this is a lot of facts and figures. Right now, this is a bit of a snapshot for CFB Shilo. It's 35 kilometers east of Brandon. I happen to live in Brandon, and I commute there. It takes about 25 minutes or so there or back. It's a large base, and we'll see many maps of the grounds because this is part of the history of the base itself. So 40,000 hectares, measuring about 15 kilometers by 30 kilometers. And that's one of the advantages of it, is because the land is actually relatively poor for farming. It's given a lot of space for large-scale maneuvers, tanks, artillery, aircraft, all kinds of things. We'll get back to the current strength right now, but the main 2 units right now are the regular force units that are part of the 1st Canadian Mechanized Brigade Group, based out of Edmonton, and they are the 1st Regiment of the Royal Canadian Horse Artillery and the 2nd Battalion of the Princess Patricias Canadian Light Infantry. I'll have a little more to say about them towards the end. As I mentioned previous, though, there's lots of other supporting units. There's the 3rd Canadian Division Support Training Center. That is a school essentially that runs courses like basic training and leadership courses, among others. There's a signals detachment from, I think from Edmonton, that help run our computers and our communications. There's a health services center, and that list could go on, of course. There's the Royal Canadian Electrical and Mechanical Engineers. There's the logistics branch that gives supply. There's food services. There's the military police. The list goes on and on. It's basically everything that's required for a small town. In addition to its regular force, or in other words, full-time soldiers and their missions, it also supports the reservists like myself. And so, as I mentioned, I'm a logistics officer, and I moved from a service battalion in Toronto to the 26th Field Artillery Regiment in Brandon. And so the training area at CFB Shilo supports reserve units, all across northwestern Ontario, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. And that's not included in the figures that you see there. So there's 1,800 military personnel plus civilian employees. My job on the base is a civilian job. And so I'm wearing a different hat, quite literally, it's a beret when I'm doing my reserve work. There's about 1,700 people that live on the base. So that includes, spouses and dependents, in about 600 private married quarters. And that's in addition to the single soldiers barracks. And as I mentioned before, myself and many other military and civilian employees live off the base. It's located here. The black square roughly boxes off the sides of the training area, and the yellow star there indicates where the center of the base is, the built-up area of it. And you can see that it's relatively close to Brandon and about 2 hours or so west of Winnipeg. This map shows in sort of a hatched pinkish red, you'll see the training area for Shilo. I had some better maps, but I didn't want to put out anything that might be restricted or protected for national interests. And so this is a publicly accessible map. And if I use my cursor, can you see that?
I'm not seeing, oh yeah, we are seeing your cursor. Go right
Oh,
ahead.
great. Yes, sorry, I meant to check before we started if you could see that or not, but we'll be talking, for example, about this corner of the training area, amongst others. So from Brandon, it's about midway between Brandon and Carberry. And this land here, if we go to the next map, you'll see it's not very productive. And across Canada, most army bases tend to be on poor land. It's land that was in part formerly farmed, and there's certainly farms around it, but it's very sandy soil. That sand especially concentrated on the lower right of the picture there, and we'll get back to that later. A lot of it is swamp towards the top, and so swamp and sandy soil isn't the greatest for farming, and many army bases tend to be put on this kind of marginal land, but it's ecologically very important land. So we'll go all the way back to the beginnings then, and it was not Shilo at the beginning, it was Camp Sewell. And you can see the railway station that's there. The first camp was actually named after the railway stop on the CPR line there. So some of you might know Colonel Sam Steele. He's the famous Sam Steele who was in the Northwest Mounted Police that became the RCMP, for example, and he was also involved with the Canadian militia. And he was involved with Military District Number 10 that included Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and I think maybe also Northwestern Ontario. So it's essentially the same as 38 Canadian Brigade Group that exists today. And training for the militia at the beginning of the 20th century was very decentralized, so that reserve units would practice, infantry tactics or artillery firing on privately held land in many cases. Maybe a friend of their unit or a member of their unit who had a large farm, something as simple to arrange as that. But on the one hand, this meant that different groups training separately and under really varied conditions meant that standards weren't consistent and in many cases weren't up to snuff. And so Sam Steele started looking around for a larger training area to use, and he found this large sandy plain near Sewell Station on the CPR line, and he arranged for its use with Hudson Bay Company, I believe, so that in June of 1910, the first summer training occurred there. It was just 10 days long. It had 1,472 officers and men, and something that we might not think about today, but over 1,000 horses as well. And so there's all the requirements that go together with that, so far as the forage for the horses as well. Now this steadily increased year by year, so that in summer of 1914, this is on the eve of World War I, but prior to it, there were 6,600 men and 3,500 horses training there that summer. But it was temporary. It was really only set up as needed in the summer. The troops needed to bring what they needed with them. They were sleeping in tents, eating on temporary tables, and the like. So here you can see one of the larger setups of it. This is just at the this is at the end of its time as Camp Sewell. This is in 1915. And you can see there the bell tents, as they're called, that most of the men were staying in throughout this time. But you can see there that even after almost a year of the First World War. It's still very, very rudimentary. And they trained a number of the battalions for overseas service in the Canadian Expeditionary Force of World War I there. So this photograph here, for example, shows dinner time for the 78th Battalion. This is again at Sewell in 1915. You can see the men arranged there, but again, they're sleeping in those bell tents that you can see maybe over here at the back right-hand corner. You see other bell tents in the foreground, but then there's a mess tent here in just behind the tables. But it's still not very permanent, right? It's still very rudimentary and temporary as far as the setup goes. This was to change, though, in 1915 when Camp Sewell becomes Camp Hughes. And the story for that is that it got named for the Minister of Militia, Sam Hughes, not by the Army, but in fact, because the CPR changed the name of this railway station from Sewell Station to honor the Minister of Militia, they renamed it Hughes Station. And since they were named after the station, and since people needed to know when to get off the train, I take it, they changed the name of the camp to go with it too. So it became Camp Hughes now in 1915. And it became the second biggest city in Manitoba, and I think maybe one of the biggest on the prairies, if you were to count just its raw population, because for each of 1915 and 1916, there were 30,000 men training there. It was arranged into battalion lines, and you see one of them there in that photograph, but just bell tents almost as far as the eye can see. This changed in 1917 when they changed the training program. Instead of raising these huge battalions in Canada, training them at places like Camp Hughes, and then shipping them sort of as a whole over to Europe, instead they sent, they trained the basic training of smaller groups here in Canada, shipped them to England where they were constituted into battalions there. And so Camp Hughes, it shrank a little bit again because they weren't raising such large groups there at the time. One of the most interesting thing about Camp Hughes, though, is that they recreated a section of the Western Front on the landscape that was there. And so you see here a section of the trench system, and you might, if you recognize what it is, you can see the zigs and the zags that they put into the trench systems there. And there would be a dugout here where you see an entrance there. The zigs and the zags and the dugouts, of course, are to protect the men on the front from shrapnel and other harms coming down the trench line as shells and other bombs explode. I wish now, actually, that I think about it, that I've included some photographs of Visitors' Day, because once per, at least once per every battalion's training regimen, they would let the relatives come and visit. And so we've got, pictures of wives with their babies there in the trenches and other seemingly incongruous things, because it really does look like the Western Front. They tried very hard to replicate it. This replicates part of a British or Commonwealth trench. You can see there with the sandbags. But they built up other sections with the kind of wickerwork walls that the Germans tended to have. So this was a very valuable asset because they had veterans coming back and advising them on how to prepare these trenches for more realistic training here in Canada, so that the men would be ready when they got to France or Belgium. Just to touch briefly on the artillery that happened there, Canada had always lagged a little bit behind developments in Britain when it came to advances in weaponry in general, and this includes the artillery. Some of you might know the story about the Lee Enfield and the Ross rifle in Canada. Canada similarly was slow to pick up on some of the new technologies, so that you see the gun on the left. That is a gun that was made at the end of the 19th century, and it was used in the Boer War. It's one from our collection. And it's a breech loading gun, but it's in many ways a lot like an old-fashioned cannon. Whenever it fired, it would push backwards. And they put it in this little spade, as it's called, to try to stop it from doing so. But they were still aiming it by looking down the sights, very much like you would do with a rifle. And by today's standards, it's not a modern weapon. They still had some of these in Canada that they used for training purposes at the time of the First World War. But Canada had started to move towards more modern ones. And you can see a modern First World War gun on the right-hand side. That's called a quick-firing 18-pounder gun. Quick-firing because the ammunition charge and the shell come in together. 18-pounders because that's how much the shell would weigh. But the important thing to see about this is this item there. And if you can see my mouse again there, that is a hydraulic ram or piston. And what it does is to absorb the recoil of the lower part here. This is the barrel itself. And so as that is forced backwards, the piston inside the hydraulic there will absorb that shock so that the gun is not moving out of its location, hopefully. And so they don't have to re-aim it every time. So that's an example of the kind of technology that was advancing that you can try to track as you go through our galleries if you were to visit our museum. Well, if you remember those bell tents and the mess tents and the battalion lines that we saw from Camp Sewell and very early Camp Hughes, this will look incongruous to you, I think. This is not Leave Day in Brandon or Winnipeg. This is the entrance to Camp Hughes. The area just outside of the military controlled area was developed into what was called the Midway, or labeled here Main Street, and they had 6 theaters there. They had restaurants and cafes, and they had photographer studios, and they had drugstores, and they had banks, almost any kind of amenity that a soldier might need in the middle of nowhere on the prairie was available to them there on the Midway. And of course, a lot of single men with pay in their pockets and nowhere to go is a very captive audience. And so you can maybe understand how this sprang up seemingly out of nowhere during the First World War. There are the Twin Theaters, for example. You can see that it's labeled, whether it's true or not, I can't vouch, but it says that it's Canada's largest picture house. Also notice the ladies. And so whether this is a family day or not, I don't know, but certainly there was, a civilian crossover there in those areas at least. These give you some other examples of the amenities available there. The one on the left is not a civilian operated one. That's rather a canteen, in other words, a store/cafe run by the battalion itself. But the ones on the other side there are civilian ones, and they include a news agency on the top, photographers on the lower left, and then the Bank of Hamilton on the bottom right. So everything that a soldier might need. And within the base, they had a very large population that needed care. And they had nursing sisters, they had doctors, and they had a hospital that took very good care of them. They did not, in fact, have any large outbreaks of communicable disease. They had a few cases. They had more chronic disease, though, let's say that when we do visit the cemetery a little bit later on, you'll see that it's not very populated. Maybe not the right word for a cemetery, but it's not a very large cemetery. There on the right, you'll see the swimming pool, labeled as largest in the West. But in fact, it was overseen by a medical doctor, and it operated as much for cleanliness as for recreation. And so the men that were there were doing double duty as recreation, but also as bath time. So this carries us through to the end of the First World War. At the end of that, and we usually say 1918, but in fact, the First World War sort of carried on in places like Russia in the aftermath of the revolution. There was Canadian troops involved in Siberia and North Russia. So after 1919, the Army started to really stand down, and Camp Hughes reverted to a summer training area. And so it went back to sort of sleeping through the winters and then reactivating in the summer. And then for those years through the 20s and the early 30s, it operated much as it had before, but with a little better infrastructure. So kind of like Camp Sewell before it, but with more amenities. And it included, again, the local militia regiments from the region, but also some of the regular force units from Winnipeg. And that included one of the batteries of the Royal Canadian Horse Artillery. It included part of the Princess Patricias Canadian Light Infantry. And it included Lord Strathcona's horse. So what are today, at least, artillery, infantry, and armored. Now, what's the problem with Camp Hughes? Why is Shilo no longer centered on Camp Hughes? Well, briefly, the answer is the Douglas Marsh. You see it down here. You see my mouse. As you travel on the Trans-Canada, if you're coming from Winnipeg, you'll see that here there's signs for a rest station, washrooms, and a place to pull off, and there's actually hiking trails in the forest as well. And it's labeled as the Camp Hughes rest station. It's not actually on the site of Camp Hughes itself, really. That's farther down here. So if you were to go across the Trans-Canada to the south and follow this road down and then turn right, you can get to the grounds of Camp Hughes, and that's centered here in this area, south of the railway line that you see transversing it there. So if the green is swamp, you can see that they were really very much hemmed in so far as the area that they had to work with. If they wanted to go on large scale maneuvers, they couldn't because of private property on the north and on the west, and swamp surrounding them, especially on the south. And so they started to look around for a better training. And we'll get to that. The secret is that it's Shilo. Now, Camp Sewell and Camp Hughes today, you can go and visit it today. It's a National Historic Site. There's signage, maybe not the optimal signage, but you can find your way there if you know where to look. And when you get there, again, there is guidepost signage and informative signage there. I took these photos here this summer. It gives you some idea of how the landscape has changed. So in the old photograph there, you see the railway line running through it and all the bell tents in the distance. And in the foreground here, with the men in formation there in between. And today it is really a very sleepy area with, no sign on the surface of what was to become. There's been some archaeological survey and excavation that happened there. At first, it was carried out by the Manitoba Military History Society. And then there were 2 summers of a public archaeology field school that were operated by Brandon University in conjunction with the RCA Museum. And I apologize that I don't have more photographs of the artifacts we found because they're really a wonderful collection. I put some of them this year on display in the base headquarters at CFB Shilo. And it includes everything from, spent casings to cat badges, to china, to barbed wire and everything else in between. And I've just got one fork here to represent that. But they were able, as you can see on the left there, to actually map out many of the landmarks of Camp Hughes. And you'll see the swimming pool there, the barber shop, the commander's hut, the post office. And then these over here are some of those large theaters that we saw in that photograph there before. So not really much to see on the surface. Even as an archaeologist looking at it, it would be hard to make it out, but this kind of research together with the old maps has come a long way in mapping that all out. And if you continue down south, you can come to the Camp Hughes Cemetery, and there are not many servicemen buried there. I think that they actually are outnumbered by local residents. Many of them, sadly, because of the medical conditions of the 20th century, many of them are sadly children from the neighborhood who are buried there. But you do see there some military you know, those Veterans Affairs style of headstones that are there. And the one that's on the right is in fact the oldest one for the first soldier who died at the camp. Watch out for the poison ivy when you visit there, because the cemetery is almost overgrown with it. But if you continue out into the training area, you can come across these trenches. And I recommend before you do that you visit the the Manitoba Military Historical Society's website and download their field guide for it. It'll give you some idea of where to go and what to look for. But if you were to cross the training area, it's kind of hard to miss these trenches, isn't it, right? So we can see the zigzag patterns of those that are there today. And if you can't afford to get to France or Belgium to see the Western Front in person, this is the next best thing, because these are authentic First World War trenches built to the same design and then subsequently abandoned. So in many ways, the landscape is much better preserved than it is on the Western Front. And this is how that was mapped out. I won't go through the different trenches, but you know, you can see some of the different lines there with the communication trenches that are connecting them. Okay. So what happens to Camp Hughes? What happens? Why is it now CFB Shilo? And how do we move forward to today? So I might use the terms a little bit interchangeably, but that year of 1968, some of you might know as being the year that the Canadian forces were unified. So the Canadian Army, Air Force, and Navy became the Canadian Armed Forces. And a lot of terminology changed then too, so that Camp Shilo, for example, became CFB Shilo. And if I use those terms interchangeably, that's why. So CFB or Camp Shilo, I should maybe probably say, was established because Camp Hughes was really hemmed in by the marsh. They started using the spaces as early as 1928 during those summer training sessions, and construction began in 1931 as a relief project for the Great Depression. By 1934, they were able to start militia training there, and again, it was initially pretty rudimentary, but they dismantled, I think we should say. They dismantled the buildings at Camp Hughes, and they used some of that for building the new Camp Shilo. And Camp Shilo, again, continued very much as Camp Hughes had, and Camp Sewell before it, as a summer training area. And this was to continue on until World War II. And just as World War I had been the impetus for a lot of development at Camp Sewell / Camp Hughes, World War II, of course, brought a lot of development to Camp Shilo. You can see in 1940 there, again, those rows and rows of bell tents, but with some early buildings. By the post-war years there, 1948 is the that I've got, you'll see a lot more permanent structures. You'll see some water towers and really a lot of infrastructure that's been invested during those war years. And training in Shilo really ran the gamut of the Army. It served as one of the major training areas during the war. The training units that were based there, so not individual fighting units, but rather the training schools that taught the soldiers how to fight. 3 of those were based at Shilo. That included the Artillery Training Center, what later became the Royal Canadian School of Artillery, the Canadian Infantry Training Center, and the Canadian Parachute Training Center. And for those of you who know Brandon, in fact, the Artillery Training Center, their needs were so big that they actually had another branch in Brandon as well. And just as the wars brought improvements for infrastructure on the base, it also brought improvements to the artillery. And I'm really cherry picking some of the pieces that I can show off here because there are so many of them. But so far as some of the main guns go for the Canadian artillery, there were again improvements made to those. So the one on the left is the one that we saw at the end of the First World War, the quick firing 18-pounder. The one on the right is what became the standard Canadian field artillery piece. There were lots of others too, but this is the most common one, and it's a quick firing 25-pounder. So now it's 7 pounds heavier shell, And maybe most importantly, one of the main differences there is the base that it's on. It actually allows for a complete traverse. In other words, you can turn all the way around on that without having to reposition the gun and lose its level, among other things. So that became a real standard for the Canadian Army for many years, even after the Second World War. Okay, so I want to highlight a few things that we might not think about with the Canadian Army. We certainly might not think about for the Canadian artillery. And one of those is nuclear missiles. Canada had nuclear capable tactical missiles. Now, some of you might know about Canada's involvement with the United States and its nuclear weapons agreements. For example, Canada had agreements with the United States. We think about it primarily for the Air Force. So with the CF-104 Starfighter, for example, and with the Bomark missile, in those cases there, Canada trained to use nuclear weapons, but we didn't have our own because we decided against it, even though Canada was involved with the Manhattan Project. But in case of nuclear need, the United States would sign over control of those weapons. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that there was also one for the Army for tactical use. And so these are for, shorter range battlefield situations. And this is the Honest John missile that you see here. You see soldiers, they're readying it for launch. And there are two missiles, one on its trailer and one on its launcher, that are currently at our museum. So I'd love maybe someday to do a temporary exhibit called something like Canada's Nuclear Army, because it's something that not many people know about. Shilo hosted the second surface, you see up at the top, SSM, that stands for Surface to Surface Missile Training Battery. Canada only had 2 batteries of these missiles. One was training here in Shilo. One was in Germany as part of Canada's NATO commitment. And neither one had nuclear weapons under our control. So we didn't have the nuclear weapons at warheads at Shilo, but they were prepared to train to use them. And another thing that we don't think about when we think about the Canadian Army, and definitely not the Canadian artillery, is flying aircraft. But in fact, the artillery of Canada and its allies has a long history with Army aviation. And in our collections at the RCA Museum, we own 2 aircraft, not including drones, remote control or automated UAVs and the like. We have 2 aircraft. We have an Oster, which is the older model, but very similar to the one that you see pictured there, which is the Cessna L-19 Bird Dog. And they were operated by the Canadian Army, not the Air Force, by the Canadian Army for what's called air observation post or spotting. And so what their job is to fly over the battlefield to monitor where the rounds of the artillery are landing and to call in improvements so that they can get on target. On the left, you'll see flow and field. That's a flattish area of the training area. It's right along Highway 340 after you pass, if you were to drive south past the main gate of the base and continue onwards, it's that area that's on the left. On the east side of Highway 340 as you go down. But you can see the hangars and the service buildings there. And I suppose something that we do think about with the Canadian Army, but not maybe for the artillery, are parachutists. But we did have aerial gunners. We had artillery soldiers who were, and we still do, have parachute qualified artillery soldiers, or gunners as we call them. So the photos on the right and on the left there are from a photo souvenir book that we have of a Canadian gunner who underwent his training at Shilo. They're boarding the aircraft. They're probably at CFB Rivers or maybe at Brandon. But the ones on the left, but they're going to drop over Shilo. And you can see them doing static practices and then moving to these simulators that we see on the left. And then the final jump before the real thing is from the old jump tower. that existed at CFB Shilo and was a landmark for many years. Some people here still remember it. That area of Fluin Field that I showed you before, because it's open and relatively flat, it's still one of the jump areas that are there. And while they don't do parachutist training at CFB Shilo, they don't run the course there anymore. It's still used as a landing zone or a drop zone sometimes. So that includes that airfield. Now, 1970 saw a lot of changes in the post-war army. This is the Cold War, of course, and Canada's got commitments in NATO. And 1970 just was soon after the unification. And because of unification, there were a lot of shakeups that happened. And we see some units that have been there for many years moving out and some coming in. And during this talk, I'm not going to stress, what year a particular unit came or left. But 1970 seemed to be a big year for this. We have the artillery school moving out, the drone troop moving out, one of the supply units and the band moving out. But then coming in, 2nd Battalion, PPCLI, keep them in mind because, again, they'll show up later, but they soon went to CFB Winnipeg. You might know about the development of the Capyong barracks that they had there into the first urban First Nations reserve. There on the part of the former part of CFB Winnipeg. That's where they ended up afterwards. And then the 3rd Regiment of the Royal Canadian Horse Artillery came here from CFB Winnipeg. And what were they shooting then at the time? Here are some of the weapons that they had. The M109 you see on the left is one of our most popular attractions inside the museum. Children and many visitors, of course, call it a tank. It really does look like one to most people. The difference is so far as the way that it's used, and also to an extent the turret. The turret on this one doesn't turn. It is a self-propelled howitzer, so it's really just a gun on a mounting so that it can move. So it's not intended to engage in one-on-one field combat the way that a tank would. And they used many guns over the course of the Cold War into the present day. What you see on the right there is the C1 105mm howitzer. That is one that was used for many years, and it was later outclassed, and they moved up to a 155mm as well. But the C1 continues in a way now because 2 generations later, what's now called the C3 is it's based on that gun. It's the one that's still used by the Canadian Army Reserve units, including ours here in Brandon. Air observation continued, but now after unification, anything that flew sort of came under the aegis of the Air Force. And so we've got there part of the Air Observation Post Detachment from 408 Squadron. And in the background, you can see some long in the tooth kind of vehicles and guns, actually. There's a 5.5-inch howitzer on the right. In the middle, there's a 25-pounder that we saw in the Second World War. Then there's a Priest, which is another kind of self-propelled artillery there on the left. And in the background, of course, is that iconic jump tower. So what was life like in CFB Shilo in 1970? I want to read a little bit of this because this is a guide for new members who were posted to CFB Shilo. And I don't know how intentionally humorous it is, but essentially it's saying, okay, you've heard the stories, some of that is true, but here's what Shilo has to offer, because Shilo had the reputation as being remote, as being cold, as being featureless, and maybe boring. To some extent, that reputation still survives, but the rest of this booklet goes on to try to disprove that reputation. And certainly there are many things to do here today, although, as we'll see again, with modern roads and all, Shilo is not nearly as isolated as it once was. So what was life like in Shilo in 1970? Well, they had cable TV with 6 stations. Yes, there's not a zero missing from that. They had three schools. They still have the 2 elementary schools here today, but high school is closed and they go to Brandon now. They had a library. They still do. They have theater. They still do. Churches, they still do. So far as sports go, I can't vouch for whether all of these are still in existence, but this is just a sampling of what's listed in that booklet: bowling, swimming, hockey, golf, curling, dancing, judo. The list just goes on, as well as the clubs too. So the automotive club, I joined that because I've got an old car that I want to fix up. There's a bridge club. The scouts are still there. The guides, I think, are still, yes, in fact, I can say that the guides are still there too. Theater club, wildlife, I don't know about those, but you can see that brand spanking new shopping center there on the right. And that's what's become this now. So, you can compare and contrast these, but it's actually remarkably similar, considering that it was built in 1961. And it's interesting, in our archives, we've got some of the documents that sort of make the argument for building this complex. It's like a little mall. It really became a mall in 1983 with the popularity of malls across North America. But you'll see the original things that it was built with, and there were a few more things like a bank and a repair shop and other things on the base as well. So it's still, again, quite similar to today. Today it's a Canex though, and the Groceteria, which is an awesome name, and the general store, which also was called the family store, I think would have had clothing and things like that. So there's maybe a little bit less of the department store feel to it, although they've still got a fair bit of that as far as appliances and things go. But it's hard these days to compete with some of the department stores that are in a nearby community like Brandon. And Brandon, right? I mentioned that I'm in Brandon right now. I commute there every day. It's about 25 minutes or so. This is what really made that feasible, was that in 1970, they finally got around to paving the road. And you didn't have to go all the way up to the Trans-Canada to get between the two. So this I think was a lifeline to Shilo so far as its connectivity to the rest of the world goes. Another really important event that happened in the 1970s and that continued all the way up until 2000 was that the Germans came. And it's interesting to read old newspaper articles from that time about concerns, on the one hand, about the foreignness of the Germans, on the other hand, about the environmental impact that they might have with all of their tanks that were training here. But again, arguments against that, including Canada's commitment to NATO and its partners, the money that the Germans would bring in. And so they stayed here for, what is that? That's 27 years, and over 140,000 German soldiers trained here. So they were able to do large scale maneuvers here, particularly with their tanks. And they go by the name of Gates. So the German Army Training Establishment, Shilo. Sometimes when you ask for directions on the base, you'll still get told to, go down past the old German this or that, and turn left. But of course, you need to have been here for a while to know that. All right. So far as the recent past goes, before we get into the modern or the present day too, I want to consider a quick case study, because if any of you have been to Spruce Woods Provincial Park, which my boys love, again, despite all the poison ivy, many of you who have passed through there on the highway might have been to the Spirit Sands, sand dunes that are there. So that is, if you can see my cursor again, these dunes that are here. If you'll remember, I mentioned about how Army bases tend to be placed on poor farming land, poor productivity. This is one big reason why. This sand is actually left over from a large delta that formed from the what was the Assiniboine River during the glacial periods and during the Ice Age. And there's so much sand here that it actually has limited vegetation and forms these sand dunes. And before we leave this map, if you can see the line that's here, this becomes very important here. So you can see here it's labeled as the Spirit Sands. But it wasn't always called the Spirit Sands. It was called the Bald Head Hills through most of the 20th century. So that's this area of the training range that I've circled on the right there. This was what's labeled K there, that polygon that's down here, was a bombing range for the RCAF station Rivers nearby to us. And it was used for bombing runs, it was used for napalm. And in 1971, CFB Rivers closed and they transferred this area to CFB Shilo. And it continued in use as a ricochet area for the artillery range. So essentially a buffer beyond the normal range for where the artillery rounds are supposed to land. But people started entering it illegally for dune buggying, for hikes, for summer day excursions and the like. And they know that there's or at least they knew at the time, that there were at least 2 500-pound bombs there. And there were possible fines of up to $1,000 and 12 months imprisonment. But as we'll see, that really didn't keep people out. So you get these newspaper articles that happen soon after the transfer to from Rivers to Shilo. Here, the Saskatoon Star Phoenix is telling you there's signs telling you to keep out, but don't let that stop. You know, it's worth it to break the law to go in to see these beautiful dams. The base responds. You know, they say, look, we have no idea how many bombs there might be in this buffer zone. That, you know, recently in this case, when this was published in 72, that they'd found 200-pound shells that hadn't detonated there. You see there a soldier there applying plastic explosives to detonate one of them. So the Army kept saying it's too dangerous. You know, we'd have to sieve it down to the depth of 30 feet to make sure we didn't miss anything. Please don't go in there. Well, people don't listen. So here's the Toronto Star encouraging people to go there. And if you look here in the middle of the left there, you'll see there's a quote here that's supposed to be coming from a soldier. He says, "I can't tell people to go in, but everybody does, so you can too." I don't think that his commander would be terribly happy with that answer, but this is the kind of laissez-faire attitude that prevailed. And you know, Canadian soldiers don't like to interfere with civilians, and so you'll see the soldiers here in their Jeep as this family walks by. People want it open to the public. Here in 1974, you know, they're basically asking for that. You know, the Bald Head Hills, they're still not open to the public. Well, you know, they've never been open to the public, but people wanted it. And so what happened then is by 1983, the Canadian Armed Forces had to, well, the federal government had to renew its lease, and the province held the land. And so what they did was they carved off part of the Bald Head Hills to give people this experience. And so they cut off, like you see there, about 1,214 hectares. And the difference is here. So this is, you know, kind of blown up, and it's a bad example. But if you see this yellow rectangle there, the border now goes up on the left and on the top side of that rectangle, whereas before it went the opposite, went along near the bottom and then up along the top. So that this area here of the Bald Head Hills, now known as the Spirit Sands, are open to the public. I'm not going to focus too much on this because I'm looking at my clock, but you know, these two articles there are just meant to contrast this. On the left, we've got one saying the military, and especially in this case, the German tanks are bad. They're spreading this bad weed. And then on the right, you've got this glowing article saying that, you know what, CFB Shilo protects ecology. It gives animals a safe place to be. You know, hopefully they don't get hit. But, you know, it basically acts as a wildlife preserve. So there's, you know, two different perspectives on that. But again, today, this is why, if you've ever been to Spirit Sands, or you know, maybe this encourages you to, but if you come down from Carberry there, this is the main campground for Spruce Woods Provincial Park. And then on the other side here, you can go and visit this part of the dunes here, and you can see what they look like there. And so this is sort of the story behind it. But you'll see there the text on the top right, it still cautions you. And there are still signs there that I saw this summer when I visited with my boys. You know, don't touch suspicious objects, report any unusual objects you might find, because again, this was a former National Defense Range. So to conclude, what's CFB Shilo like today? Well, it's still the tip of the spear. It's not a sleepy supporting base. It's got, real hard fighting army units at it. This is the extent of the base today. The shopping center that we saw is here. Our museum is here. But this is here, the main artillery regiment, 1 RCHA. This is the main infantry unit here, 2 PPCLI. These are all family houses on this side here. Oh, and don't forget the golf course. So 1st Regiment, Royal Canadian Horse Artillery. Again, it's, the original regular force unit of Canada's Army with A and B batteries going back to 1871. This is their 150th anniversary. They now include A, B, and C batteries, and they fought in every conflict for Canada basically since the Northwest Rebellion up to and including the war in Afghanistan. And this is their day-to-day job. That is their brute that they own now. That's 155 millimeter towed lightweight howitzer called the M777. Canada was the first military to fire it in combat, and that was in Afghanistan. And then there's the infantry, the 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricias Canadian Light Infantry. They're the ones that moved from Winnipeg in living memory, at least. And they were, Canada's first unit to fight in World War I. They were privately raised. They got there so early that the Canadian Expeditionary Force didn't even exist. So they were put in with the British units when they got there. And today they include 3 rifle companies of mechanized infantry, together with their support companies. You'll see their service there. What really sets them apart and gives them a bit of an edge is that they fought off practically the entire Chinese army at the Battle of Capion. And they were awarded the US Presidential Unit Citation. And so there's a special bar that they can wear in their uniforms. And you'll see that blue ribbon hanging from their unit flag. That's that award that's there. And so there you see some of them there with their light armored vehicle. That's what makes them, of course, mechanized infantry. And finally, of course, you can come and visit our museum. So the RCA Museum, that's our front door there. Our website is rcamuseum.com. You can start or end outside. There's these are photographs of our gun park. So we've got both friendly and, let's say, enemy artillery, as well as self-propelled artillery. That's a Soviet one there. That's outside, and we've also got other ones that are scattered around the base. But there's a big concentration around on the grounds of our museum proper. And then inside, we've got galleries that are highlighting conflicts, throughout the history of Canada's military, as well as, special galleries. At the top there, you'll see our small arms display. The bottom left, you'll see our Manitoba history gallery. On the bottom right, you'll see a gallery that highlights medals and awards like the Victoria Cross and other awards of valor. Okay, this is, as I said, the 150th anniversary of A and B batteries, making it the 150th anniversary of the founding of Canadians Regular Forces and the 150th anniversary of the Royal Regiment of Canadian Artillery. So we put on this special exhibit here to honor the 150th anniversary, and we've got online, we've got an 18-minute video that highlights that history. We've got an interactive 3D tour that you can take, as well as lots of photos and other online resources. So that's just shy of 8 o'clock there. That brings me
I didn't want to stop you, Jonathan, because you had so much
to the end of the exercise. Right.
We didn't really have time for questions, but if people have more questions, they should probably visit the museum and ask them.
That's a great idea. Again, rcamuseum.com. Sorry?
Can people take tours of the museum, or are they just self-directed?
They can request a tour. That's certainly an option. We don't have a special charge for it, so it depends largely on the availability of our staff. We haven't had as many visitors as usual because of COVID, like almost everything else in this world today. And so if you come by, do ask if you'd like a tour, or if you have any questions about the guns. I do see that there's something in the chat there. I don't know if
One of our members has been to the museum, and she was just mentioning that it's well worth going to.
There you
So
go.
we have some other
Well,
questions we're not going
that's
to get
good
to,
hear.
so people are
Thank
going to
you.
have to go on their own to CFB Shilo and check out the museum. Thank you, Jonathan, so much for being with us tonight.
Very well.
Really appreciate having
Okay.
you here. For everyone else watching, if you're not one of our UFCW members and you are interested in becoming one and thinking that maybe your workplace should be unionized, you can go to our website, ufcw832.com, and there's a big part where it says join union, and you can figure out how you can unionize your workplace as well. So thank you, Jonathan. Really a pleasure having you here, and thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Okay, good night.